I'm just listening to your plaintiff's testimony, some of the language that you're using in describing your lawsuit, and it sounds like the evidence that you guys are using is not necessarily schools and civics teachers. It's more based off of the academic outcomes that are coming out of these schools. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about, I mean, it just sounds very familiar to a case in Michigan in which the plaintiffs were talking about reading, like the fact that the kids are coming out of school, they don't know how to read. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about what sorts of academic outcomes concern you about America's public schools that now is causing people to not be ready to be citizens or to vote.
Well, I think you've heard from all of our plaintiffs that reading is necessary but not sufficient for purposes of exercising one's constitutional rights. So certainly we support all efforts around the country to make improvements in public education. But as I said, necessary but not sufficient. What you've heard is that young people, even who may have capabilities in educational fundamentals, are not learning what they need to know to participate fully in adult life. And we think that's a much more complicated task. And to get a little bit back to Linda's question, this case is not about the mechanics of education, it's about the purposes of education. And so when you look at those purposes, we think that sets a pretty high bar for what America's public schools are supposed to be doing. And we feel we have very strong evidence in the huge mountain of data that's been collected since the late 90s about educational outcomes. We have substantial evidence that schools are not meeting those requirements. But also in the lived experience of these students and families, we know that education is not meeting their needs and is unresponsive in many instances to the actual way in which students and families want to access that education.
I wanted to just say a word about the other case that you mentioned, this Detroit literacy case, which I think is an indication that the time has come. They're basing their legal arguments on the same legal theory to some extent that we are, the Rodriguez case, and the fact that the Supreme Court left an opening and said we may focus at some future date on what is the basic education you need for citizenship. So the case they're making in Detroit is that kids in the Detroit public school systems are getting such a wretched education that they're basically 90% of them are functionally illiterate. And they're saying to the court, if you can't read and write, you obviously can't be a citizen. Well, I've got to tell you, I'm good friends with the lawyer who brought that case. We've both been talking for a couple of years about strategies on this. And quite frankly, I asked him to reconsider the approach he was taking, because I said we're going to get one opening possibly in the Supreme Court. And if they come out with a ruling that the basic level of education you need for citizenship is 6th grade literacy, well, that will be very helpful to the kids in Detroit. I don't know how helpful it's going to be to kids in Rhode Island or the rest of the country. We need a more robust understanding of what education for citizenship is. And as Jen was indicating, as our plaintiffs were indicating, as Professor Santo has indicated, to be a capable citizen, and it is really critical for the functioning of our democracy going forward now. Kids have to have not only the ability to read and write, they have to have an in-depth knowledge of governmental structures, of history, of the perspective of things. They have to have what we call democratic deliberation skills. That's critical analytic thinking. That's being able to have respectful conversations with people with whom you have different views. And that's not easily learned. And it's not easy for teachers to convey. It's one of the reasons it doesn't happen. But that is what's needed, and we're saying that's what schools have to do. Kids have to have democratic experiences. I talked earlier about the importance of student government, student newspapers, debate societies, drama productions, learning these interpersonal skills, getting along with kids from different races, religions, and backgrounds. They've got to learn democratic values like the rule of law, like equity. This is the kind of robust education we're talking about. Our 45-page complaint goes into this in some detail. And if we get one shot at this with the Supreme Court, we want to impress upon them that they've got to talk about a really substantial education that is really going to make a difference in all kids' lives.
Did anyone of you
Jim,
have
if I may,
seen?
just very briefly, it was my honor to try the first case in the mid-90s as you've mentioned, Linda, about the adequacy and equity. And then Sam and I tried the second case more recently. And we have, through our brilliant lawyering, we went trying to establish that every child would have a right to an adequate and equitable education. What we did establish through the Rhode Island Supreme Court is that there is no right to an education in Rhode Island. So we're really at the end of our rope here in Rhode Island, legally. Absent the federal court establishing that basic right, before you get to anything else, that you have a right to an education, we can't build anything. At some point down the road, when we are successful, and I'm hoping the third try is the charm, that when we're successful, then we can start getting into issues of how we provide that and the political issues and other legal issues. But someone's got to tell our court system here in Rhode Island, yes, education is a fundamental right, and it's not. Bring it down.
Did any of you have something you wanted to add in response to that question?
I guess I could add one thing, which is that I mean, I think what we're after here is more than just simply add a civics requirement and a little bit of information about, you know, how congressional representation works, and we're done. I mean, as a historian, to me, it seems clear that this offers a transformative opportunity for the way we think about and practice education in Rhode Island. All of the sort of skills and, you know, habits of the heart and everything else that one gets from a robust civics education makes one a better critical thinker, reader, writer, speaker that will serve you well in every aspect of your life. And the earlier we start it, the better, pre-K on up. You know, it will help you as a neighbor, it'll help you as a citizen, it'll help you as a caregiver, it'll help you as a worker, and so forth. And you know, when I first got on the Providence School Board, and Keith Olivera sitting in the background there, he was with me. You know, it was, I think, my first night on the board, the budget was being presented. So I was given this enormous document, you know, that I, at that point, really had no way of unpacking. And the question I kept asking, I guess we're supposed to approve it, and we did. But the question I kept asking myself was, shouldn't we be kind of starting from what we want our kids to learn, what kind of people we want them to be, and then figuring out what resources are needed to make that happen in the most efficient way. And instead, you know, to me, it's like the equivalent of your child is sick, you have $500, you go to the doctor and you say, doctor, give my kid $500 worth of health. Well, no, I want you to make my kid healthy, and then we'll figure out how much it costs. And you know, we're not a wealthy city, but we are a wealthy society overall. This is not about resources, it's not a finance case, but you know, if we truly want to make a commitment to a democratic education, you know, it will involve some resources at some point, but we collectively as Rhode Islanders, if the court order comes down, will decide amongst ourselves what that would be.